Under the burnt-orange sky of the Arizona frontier, where the wind carried both dust and rumor, a frail figure walked between two worlds. She was the landowner's daughter, thin as a reed and pale as paper, her body worn down by sickness and sorrow. The people in town whispered that she had been cursed, that no doctor could heal her. No medicine could bring warmth back to her lifeless skin. Her father, once the proud master of the largest ranch for miles, now stood helpless before a force even wealth could not control. For all his horses and acres of land, he could not buy his daughter's breath back. Every morning, before the sun climbed over the mesas, she would sit by the window of the old hacienda, staring across the empty fields her father had worked so hard to claim. The fences stood broken now, and the cattle had long since wandered away. Her reflection in the glass frightened even her hollow eyes set deep into sharp bones. Hair thin as straw, skin pale beneath her dress. Once she had danced at county fairs, her laughter echoing like silver bells. Now she moved like a shadow in her own home, silent and unseen. It's like the spirit of a dying world. Her father could not bear to watch her fade. In his desperation, he turned toward a path most men in the territory feared. He sent word to the Apache camp beyond the river. There were stories that some Apache healers knew secrets lost to the white man. Old remedies from the earth, songs that could mend both body and soul. But no settler dared approach them. Blood had been spilled between their peoples, and the land itself seemed divided by invisible scars. Yet love for his child pushed him into that forbidden direction. When the Apaches came, the ranch hands whispered among themselves. They had seen raids and battles, had watched the sky darken with smoke from burning wagons. To see those same warriors ride up to the hacienda gates brought unease to every man. Among them was one taller than the rest, bare-chested beneath the desert sun. His long black hair tied with leather cord and beads that caught the light like tiny embers. His eyes held a calm fire, not of rage, but of power, the kind that came from a life close to the earth. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were slow and measured. Like thunder in the distance, the landowner stepped forward, trembling, yet proud in his old-fashioned coat. "My daughter," he said, his voice cracked with exhaustion, "is dying. Take her. Heal her, if your people can. I'll give you what you ask: horses, silver, land." But the warrior shook his head. "No," he said simply. "The earth cannot be bought. The spirit must choose to live." The words stung the old man's pride, but there was truth in them that he could not deny. He looked back at the doorway where his daughter stood, wrapped in a shawl that barely hid the tremor of her hands. Her eyes met the Apache's, and something in that moment shifted. A silence filled with strange understanding. She was too weak to speak, yet there was a flicker of life, a spark that had not been there before. Without waiting for her father's command, the warrior stepped closer. The girl's breath came shallow as he reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of her hair aside. "You are not ready to die," he said. She closed her eyes as if the sound of his voice itself had weight, something ancient and healing in it. Her father, broken and desperate, lowered his head. "Then she is yours," he whispered, by dusk. The girl was carried from the hacienda, wrapped in a blanket of woven fibers that smelled of smoke and sage. The Apache led his horse slowly through the desert, her frail form resting against his arm. The ranchers watched in silence from afar, none daring to interfere. They would tell the story later, each man adding his own piece, that the old man had traded his daughter to save her, that an Apache warrior had taken her into the wild, that love, or fate, had driven him to do what no settler would dare. The nights in the Apache camp were colder than she had ever known. The firelight painted long shadows on her thin face, and the strange songs of the tribe echoed through the valley. She did not understand their words, but their rhythms seemed to speak directly to her body, slow, steady, like the heartbeat she had nearly lost. The warrior stayed near, his presence both strange and comforting. He brought her broth made of herbs and wild roots, pressing the wooden bowl to her lips. At first, she resisted, too weak to move, too proud to show need. But hunger overcame her pride. Days passed. The air smelled of pine and earth, and she began to feel her body respond to the rhythm of the world around her. Her hands stopped trembling. Her breathing deepened. The warrior taught her to walk barefoot on the soil at sunrise, to let the cold bite her skin until it woke something inside her. He said the earth spoke to those who listened long enough. She thought it foolish at first, yet every dawn, she stood a little longer beside him, till one morning she no longer shivered. Rumors spread through the nearby settlements that the Apache had stolen a rancher's daughter. Some said she had been taken against her will, others whispered she had gone willingly. Men rode out looking for her, guns loaded and tempers high, but the desert swallowed their trails. Her father waited for word, torn between fear and hope. When none came, he sent riders to the Apache camp, but none returned. The boundary between the two worlds had closed. As the girl regained her strength, the distance between her and the warrior began to shift. He was no longer just her protector. There were moments, brief and quiet, when she caught him watching her, not with pity, but with something deeper, something that made her heart stumble in her chest. She didn't know if it was gratitude, affection, or something older than either. Yet even as life returned to her face, danger grew beyond the hills. The settlers spoke of revenge. The army patrols wanted the Apache chief to answer for the kidnapping. To them, the landowner's daughter was a symbol, a reason to march into the mountains. To erase what they could not understand, word reached the camp through traders. Soldiers were moving west. Her father's name was among those calling for justice. The warrior said nothing, but his eyes darkened when he heard. That night, he packed quietly, his movements slow, deliberate. When she woke, he told her they must leave before sunrise. "Your people will not understand what the earth has given you," he said. "They will try to take it back." She stared at him, torn between fear and the strange peace she had found in his world. She thought of her father's grief, of the ranch waiting in silence, of the wind whispering through broken fences. "I can't leave him," she whispered. The warrior's expression did not change, but there was sorrow in his voice when he replied, "If you return, they will see me as a thief. If you stay, they will see you as lost. But only you can choose where your spirit belongs." The fire crackled between them, and for a long time neither spoke. Outside, the desert stretched wide and silent under the stars. She looked at her hands, no longer fragile bones, but living skin. She could feel the blood warm in her veins again. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she had crossed a threshold she could never undo. When dawn broke over the red mesas, the world felt like it was holding its breath. The horses were ready. The smoke from the fire drifted into the sky, carrying the scent of sage and fate. She stood between two paths, the world of her father's land and the wild unknown that had somehow healed her. The warrior waited beside his horse, silent as the morning itself, and as the first light touched her face, she took one trembling step forward, unsure which way her heart would lead her, toward the home she came from, or the love that had brought her back to life. The desert wind rose again, carrying the promise of what was yet to come. The sun was higher now, spreading its heat over the red land, and the air carried the smell of dry mesquite and wind-blown dust. The girl stood by the edge of the camp, watching the Apache horses graze in the distance. She was no longer the same fragile figure who had been carried here like a ghost. Her steps were still soft, her voice still faint, but there was color in her cheeks again, and when she breathed, her chest rose with the rhythm of life instead of pain. Yet deep inside, she felt torn, caught between the world she was born into and the one that had saved her. The Apache warrior watched her quietly from a distance. He was not a man of many words, but his silence carried more meaning than speech. In his world, words were sacred things. You used them only when needed. He had seen too many settlers destroy what they did not understand, and he carried the memory of his fallen brothers like scars on his soul. When he looked at her, he did not see an enemy. He saw something that defied the hatred between their people, a fragile creature whose spirit refused to die. She began learning their ways. The older women of the tribe taught her to grind maize, to weave fibers, and to gather herbs that could heal wounds and ease fever. Her hands, once weak and trembling, grew steady. When she worked beside the fire, the smoke no longer made her cough. Children followed her around, curious about the pale woman who spoke little but smiled often. They brought her feathers, stones, and wildflowers, and she accepted them with quiet gratitude. At night, when the campfire burned low, she listened to the stories the elders told of the mountains that were alive, of the rivers that remembered every drop of blood spilled upon their banks, of how the earth itself kept count of every good and evil done upon it. She didn't always understand their words, but she felt their truth. There was a peace in this place that she had never known in her father's world, a balance between pain and beauty. Yet she also felt the weight of her presence among them, as if she were a fragile link. Between two worlds that could never truly meet, her father's ranch had once been the pride of the valley. Generations had worked those fields, men and horses sweating under the relentless sun. But greed and drought had turned the land cruel. The wells dried up. Cattle starved. His wealth had become a cage around him, trapping him in pride and despair. When his daughter fell ill, he had tried everything. Doctors from Santa Fe, medicines from Mexico, prayers whispered by priests, but nothing had saved her. When he gave her to the Apache, some said it was madness. Others said it was punishment from God. Now, he sat alone in his crumbling house, tormented by what he had done. Back in the desert, the Apache warriors' camp lived in quiet harmony. He had seen many winters, but this season was different. The presence of the landowner's daughter brought an unspoken tension. Some of his people whispered that she was a spirit. Others feared she would bring soldiers to their valley. Yet he stood firm. "The Great Spirit does not send life to destroy," he said. "She came to learn." And with that, the tribe kept its distance, but watched her with silent curiosity. One evening, a storm rolled across the horizon. The wind howled through the canyons, and the fires burned low under the heavy rain. The girl stood beneath a makeshift shelter, her dress soaked, her hair clinging to her face. The warrior approached, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. His touch was gentle but firm. "You are strong now," he said, "but strength is not just in the body. It is in the heart. You must learn both if you wish to live among us." She met his gaze, her voice trembling. "And what if my heart is still tied to where I came from?" He looked toward the dark horizon. "Then it will tear you apart." The storm lasted through the night, and by morning the world looked washed clean. The desert smelled of rain and wet earth. She woke to find him tending the fire, his face calm and unreadable. For the first time, she saw not just a warrior, but a man who had carried more burdens than any human should. He spoke softly about his past, how his people had been driven from their homes, how he had lost his family to settlers who saw them as less than human. "We learned to live with the land," he said, stirring the ashes, "but they wanted to own it. You cannot own what breathes." His words haunted her. She thought of her father's land, of the fences that marked where one man's world ended and another's began. Maybe that was where it all went wrong, when people began drawing lines on a land that had never asked for them. She began to understand that the sickness that had nearly killed her was more than physical. It was the sickness of the soul, born of a world that had forgotten how to listen. Days turned into weeks. The Apache camp moved with the rhythm of the seasons, following the herds, gathering food, and honoring the land. She found comfort in their simplicity, in the way each life seemed part of something greater. But peace never lasted long in that world. One afternoon a rider came from the east, dust trailing behind him. He brought news that soldiers were moving toward the Apache lands. The settlers claimed they were searching for a stolen woman. The girl felt her heart stop. She knew it was her father's doing. His guilt, his pride, or maybe his fear had driven him to send men after her. The warrior said nothing at first. He only looked toward the horizon, the muscles in his jaw tight. "They will not stop," he said finally. "They will come with fire." She wanted to tell him she could stop them, that she could go back and explain everything. But the look in his eyes told her it was too late. To the world she had left behind, she was already lost. That night, the camp prepared to move deeper into the desert. The women packed their few belongings, and the men sharpened their weapons. The girl helped where she could, though fear made her hands tremble. She had come to love this life, The sound of drums at night, the smell of smoke and pine, the laughter of children who no longer looked at her with suspicion. She could not bear to think of them in danger because of her. The warrior came to her as the fires were being put out. "You must decide before dawn," he said. "If you stay, you will be hunted. If you leave, you may never see this place again." She looked at him, tears in her eyes. "If I leave, they'll kill you." He smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "If I die protecting what is true, I die free. But if you return to them, make sure your heart remembers this land. The earth forgets nothing." The wind carried the sound of distant thunder again, but it wasn't the storm this time. It was the echo of horses, soldiers, or settlers. She couldn't tell. The sound grew stronger with each passing hour. In the dark, she sat beside the fire, her heart caught between two worlds. She thought of her father's empty house, the broken fences, the dying land. She thought of this camp, alive and full of warmth, even in the face of death. As dawn approached, the sky turned a deep shade of red. The warrior stood beside his horse, the first rays of light glinting off the spear in his hand. The tribe was ready to move, silent and swift as shadows. She rose to her feet, her decision heavy in her chest. Every path before her carried pain, yet somewhere beyond that pain, there was hope. When she met his eyes one last time, the world around them seemed to fall away. The wind tugged at her hair, the desert stretched endlessly behind him, and in that fragile moment, the line between love and destiny blurred. She took a single step forward, unsure whether it would lead her back to her past or deeper into a future she could not yet see. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, the sky filled with dust. Somewhere out there, men were coming, men who carried orders, guns, and the same fear that had once haunted her father. The Apache camp began to move, vanishing into the red dawn, and she stood between the fading shadows, caught between duty and desire, life and death, waiting for the choice that would define her fate. The sun had barely risen when the first gunshot echoed across the canyon. It wasn't close, but it was enough to send the hawks scattering from the cliffs. The Apache warrior froze, listening to the wind as it carried the faint crack of more rifles. He turned toward the east, where the soldiers would be approaching through the valley. The girl stood beside the horses, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The tribe had already started to move, gathering the children and leading the animals toward the mountains. The warrior's voice cut through the chaos, calm, steady, commanding. "They are close," he said. "We go west. The river will hide our tracks." She wanted to help, to do something, but fear made her legs weak. Every sound, every gust of wind felt like it carried danger. She could see the look in his eyes, not fear, but a grim understanding. He had seen this before. The land was filled with broken promises and blood, and he knew what men in uniforms brought with them. She thought of her father's men, proud and armed, believing they were doing what was right. None of them would understand what she had found out here, that peace didn't come from power or property, but from letting go of them. By noon, the camp had moved deep into the high desert. The land stretched wide and merciless, red and gold under the burning sun. The girl rode beside the warrior in silence, her mind a storm of guilt and confusion. Every mile that took her farther from her father's land also took her closer to a truth she wasn't ready to face. She wasn't sure anymore if she wanted to go back at all. That night, they stopped near a cluster of boulders, the only shelter for miles. The tribe gathered around a small fire, too small to draw attention. The children slept, their faces smudged with dust, while the women whispered softly. The warrior sat apart, sharpening his knife, the firelight flickering over his face. She approached quietly, the blanket he had given her pulled around her shoulders. "Will they follow us here?" she asked. He didn't look up. "They will follow until they are told to stop. And the ones who give orders don't live here. They do not see what their words destroy." His bitterness cut through her. She could hear in his voice, not anger, but exhaustion. The weariness of a man who had been fighting the same battle all his life. She wanted to tell him that not all white men were cruel, that her father had only wanted to save her. But even she didn't fully believe it anymore. Her father had given her away not out of mercy, because he couldn't face her dying in his home. The wind picked up that night, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. In the distance, a coyote howled, its cry sharp and lonely. She lay awake, listening to the shifting sounds of the desert. Sleep wouldn't come. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her father's pride. The warrior's pain, the endless circle of hate between their worlds. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard footsteps. She sat up, her heart racing, but it was only him. He walked to the edge of the camp, his spear in hand, scanning the horizon. For a long time he stood there, still as stone, before finally speaking without turning. "They are closer than I hoped." The next morning, the tracks of horses were visible in the sand. The soldiers were only a day behind. The tribe split into two groups, the women and children heading toward the canyons, the men staying behind to delay their pursuers. The warrior ordered her to go with the others, but she refused. "If they find me, they will kill you all," she said. "I have to go back." He turned sharply toward her, his eyes burning. "Go back to what? To those who see you as something to trade? You owe them nothing." His words struck deep. She wanted to believe him, but part of her heart still clung to the memory of her father's face, broken and desperate. "He's my father," she whispered. "He's all I have left." The warrior's expression softened for a moment, though his voice remained steady. "Then go. But remember this, the world you return to will not be the same, and neither will you." She didn't answer. That night she stayed close to the fire, staring into the flames until her eyes burned. The desert around her felt alive, whispering in the wind, warning her of things she couldn't yet see, far to the east. Her father's men rode hard under the command of a military escort. The old man had changed in the weeks since she'd left. His once proud posture had bent under the weight of regret. He had thought giving her away would save her, but the rumors that reached town told a different story. Some said she had been taken captive, others claimed she had joined the Apache willingly. Each story twisted the knife in his heart. Now he rode not to rescue her, but to undo what he had done, to reclaim the peace of himself. He had lost with her. The soldiers who accompanied him saw it differently. To them, it was another mission. Bring back the girl. Destroy the Apache camp. Restore order. They had little interest in what had led to her being there. The desert to them was a battlefield, not a home. Among them rode a young lieutenant, barely older than the girl herself. He had seen war before, but not this kind. He didn't understand why they were chasing a handful of people across a wasteland, and part of him wished they'd turn back. But orders were orders. As they neared the mountain pass, the signs of the Apache trail became clearer. Footprints, ashes from small fires, broken twigs. The lieutenant couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something they didn't understand. That night, as the others slept, he stood watch, staring at the horizon. Somewhere out there, a woman he had never met was about to change the fate of everyone on both sides. Back at the Apache camp, tension grew with every hour. The warrior gathered his men, preparing for the fight he knew was coming. The girl watched from a distance, her heart breaking. She wanted to stop it, to find a way for peace, but every path she saw ended in blood. When she approached him, he was binding his hair and painting his face with ashes. "If you go back," he said, "they will not listen to you. They will not see what you've seen." "I have to try," she said quietly. "If I don't, they'll destroy everything." He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Then you are braver than you know," he said. "But remember, love is not always enough to heal the wounds of men." As dawn broke, the desert trembled under the sound of horses. The soldiers were close. The warrior and his men took position along the ridge, blending into the rocks and shadows. The girl stood hidden among the women, her heart pounding with dread. She could hear the voices of the soldiers, the metallic clink of their weapons, the deep rumble of command. Then came the sound she feared most, her father's voice calling her name. It broke something inside her. She wanted to run to him, to tell him she was alive, that she had been healed in ways he could never have imagined. But she also knew that if she stepped out now, the Apache would be slaughtered. She turned toward the warrior, tears streaking her dust-covered face. "He's my father," she whispered. "He's not here to fight." The warrior's jaw tightened. "He came with men who are," he said, "and their bullets do not choose who they strike." The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the smell of gunpowder and dry sage. Somewhere beyond the ridge, horses neighed, soldiers shouted, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The girl could feel the air thick with danger, the space between life and death narrowing with every heartbeat. She knew that one wrong move could destroy everything: her father's last chance at redemption, the tribe's fragile peace, and the bond she had found in the most unlikely of places. As the first shot rang out again, echoing across the cliffs, the warrior stepped forward, his spear raised. The girl screamed his name, but her voice was drowned by the roar of rifles and the cries of men charging into the unknown. The desert that had once healed her now trembled under the weight of its oldest curse. The endless war between love and survival, the gunfire tore through the morning air, sharp and echoing across the red cliffs. Horses reared, and dust clouded the narrow pass where the soldiers had drawn their line. The Apache warrior crouched behind a ridge of stone, eyes fixed on the advancing column below. He had seen battles before, but this one was different. Among those riders was the father of the woman he loved, the man who would rather destroy the desert and let his daughter stay with its people. The warrior's pulse was steady, but his thoughts were heavy with what was at stake. Below, the soldiers formed a half-circle around the canyon mouth. The old rancher sat stiffly on his horse, his face pale under the sun. He wasn't holding a gun, but his presence gave the others courage. To him, this was not a rescue, it was redemption. He wanted to bring her home, to undo what he saw as his greatest sin. Yet the desert was not his ground. It belonged to those who knew its silence, its hunger, its hidden ways. High above, the girl watched from a crevice between two rocks. She could see her father's coat glinting in the sunlight, his familiar slouch. The way he leaned forward as if trying to spot her through the haze. Her heart ached to run to him, but she could feel the danger hanging in the air like a wire ready to snap. The warrior had told her not to move until he gave the signal. She clutched the blanket around her shoulders and prayed for something she couldn't name mercy. Maybe, or a miracle. The first rider broke from the line, galloping toward the canyon. The warrior motioned for his men to hold fire. Every second stretched thin. The rider shouted, "We come for the girl. Send her out and no blood will be shed." But everyone in the Apache camp knew that was a lie. The soldiers had brought more than rifles. They had brought the same anger that had burned through generations. The warrior's second in command, a scarred man with deep-set eyes, leaned close. "They will not stop. They never do." The warrior nodded slowly, still watching the field. "Then we fight until the land remembers us," he said. A hawk circled above them, its shadow gliding across the rocks. The girl followed it with her eyes, her breath trembling. Somewhere below, her father's voice echoed again, calling her name, breaking on the wind. For a moment, she saw him not as the man who had given her away, but as the one who used to lift her onto his horse when she was a child, his laughter filling the fields that were now dust. That memory cut deeper than any weapon. When the first shot came, it wasn't clear who fired it. The sound was swallowed by the canyon walls, but the moment shattered everything. Horses screamed, men shouted, and smoke rose from the dry brush. The warrior sprang from cover, his movement sharp and certain. Arrows hissed through the air, striking the ground near the soldiers' boots. The army answered with gunfire, bullets tearing into the rock. The girl ducked behind the boulder, her hands over her ears. The world had turned into thunder. The smell of gunpowder burned her nose. She wanted to run to her father, to tell him to stop, but she couldn't even stand. The warrior's men moved like shadows, striking fast, then vanishing into the cliffs. It was the land itself that fought with them, the echo, the dust, the heat that blinded the soldiers. Down below, the rancher shouted orders, trying to bring control back to the chaos. "Hold your line. Watch the ridges." But the men were already breaking. They had never fought on ground that seemed alive. Every time they thought they saw an enemy, he disappeared. Every sound was a trick. Meanwhile, the warrior climbed higher, his bow in hand. He could see the old man clearly now, the desperation in his movements. He knew that killing him would end this faster, but it would also end the only bridge that still existed between two worlds. He lowered his bow, conflicted, his breathing deep and slow. The fight around him raged like fire, but his focus stayed fixed on the man below. The girl finally found her voice. "Stop!" she cried, stepping from behind the rock. Her voice was lost at first, swallowed by the gunfire, but then she screamed again, louder, her throat raw. "Stop, please." For a heartbeat, the chaos paused. Even the horses seemed as still. The warrior turned sharply. She was standing on the ridge, the sunlight catching her pale hair, her arms raised. Every eye turned toward her, Apache and soldier alike. "I'm here," she cried. "Please, no more." Her father's head snapped up. "My God," he whispered, barely believing it. He kicked his horse forward, shouting for the men to hold fire. But the world had already lost control. One of the younger soldiers, panicked and deafened by the noise, saw a movement on the ridge and fired. The bullet struck the stone beside her, shattering it into a spray of dust. The warrior lunged forward, grabbing her and pulling her down as more shots followed. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her chest. He covered her with his body, his muscles tense, his eyes scanning for the source of fire. "Stay down," he said. She could feel the heat of his skin, the pounding of his heart against her shoulder. The Apaches retaliated with fury. Arrows and bullets clashed through the dry air, and the canyon filled with screams. Horses stumbled, men fell, and the desert swallowed them all. The girl could barely see through the smoke. She clung to the warrior's arm, crying, "Stop them! Please, stop them!" But there was no stopping now. This was the breaking point, the line neither side could return from. By afternoon, the battle had spread into the ravine. The warrior's people were outnumbered, but not outmatched. They moved with purpose, their knowledge of the land turning every rock and shadow into a weapon. The soldiers, trapped and sweating under the heat, began to falter. Still, they pressed forward, driven by pride and orders that no longer made sense. The old rancher rode into the canyon, despite the danger. He called for his daughter again, his voice cracked and desperate. "Where are you? Answer me." She heard him, but couldn't move. The warrior pulled her deeper into the rocks. His eyes cold with the knowledge that if the old man saw her now, both their worlds would burn. The sound of hooves drew closer. The warrior's second in command appeared, blood on his arm. "They are breaking through," he said. "We cannot hold them much longer." The warrior nodded. His face was calm, but his hands tightened around his spear. "Then we hold the mountain," he said, "until she is safe." The girl's eyes widened. "You can't fight them all," she said, her voice shaking. "They'll kill you." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Then they will learn what it costs to kill a man who loves." As the sun began to sink, its red light painting the world in fire, the last stand began. The soldiers pushed deeper, led by the rancher himself. The Apache warriors fell back into the higher ground, their silhouettes flickering in the fading light. The girl stood hidden among the stones, her heart breaking with every shot. The dust rose so thick it was hard to see who was winning, who was dying. The screams of men and horses blended with the wind until it all sounded like the earth crying out. Somewhere among that storm, her father and the warrior were moving toward the same place, drawn by love, hate, and something greater than both. When the girl saw them at last, she froze. The old man stood on one side of the ridge, gun in hand, his face streaked with sweat and sorrow. The Apache warrior stood on the other, his spear raised, his chest marked with the scars of both battle and love. The world narrowed to that single moment, the distance between them no more than a few heartbeats. The girl stepped forward, the wind whipping her hair, her voice trembling through the chaos. "Please," she cried, "don't do this." But neither man moved. They were the last remnants of two worlds colliding, and the desert held its breath for what would happen next. The sun dipped lower, the light turned blood red, and the sound of one more gun being cocked filled the silence as the story, it balanced on the edge of its fate. The gun cock sound hung in the air like the pull of fate itself. The rancher's trembling hand held the revolver steady, its barrel glinting under the setting sun. The Apache warrior stood only a few strides away, his spear still raised but unmoving, his eyes locked not on the weapon, but on the old man's face. Between them, the girl stood frozen, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst. The desert around them was silent now. Even the wind had stopped to listen. "Put it down," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Please, father. No more." The old man's hand shook harder, his eyes darting between her and the warrior. He had come all this way believing his daughter was stolen, believing the Apache had cursed her. But now, seeing her alive and strong, standing between him and the man he'd been told to hate, the truth burned through him like fire. "He took you," he said hoarsely. "He took you from me." She shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. "No, father. You gave me to him. You asked him to save me, and he did." The words cut through the air sharper than any blade. The rancher's face twisted, torn between disbelief and guilt. He remembered that night, the desperation, the sickness, the way she had lain in bed like a ghost. He had sent her away thinking he was saving her life. Now here she was, flesh and blood again, and yet changed in ways he couldn't understand. The warrior lowered his spear slowly. "She was dying," he said quietly. "The earth gave her back. Not me." His voice was deep and steady, carrying no anger, only truth. The rancher's hand faltered. The revolver lowered an inch, then rose again. Caught between pride and sorrow, before either could speak, another gunshot cracked from the ridge. The soldier who had fired it hadn't seen the truce forming. All he saw was the outline of an Apache holding a weapon. The bullet tore into the rock near the warrior's side, sparking off the stone. The girl screamed as the warrior stumbled back, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted once more. The Apache fighters, thinking their leader was hit, surged forward with cries that echoed through the canyon. The soldiers panicked, returning fire. Horses bolted, smoke filled the air, and the fragile moment of peace shattered into dust. The girl fell to her knees beside the warrior, pressing her hands against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered, her tears mixing with the dirt on his skin. "I told you," he said through a strained breath, his voice soft. "They do not understand." She looked up at the battle around them, her father shouting, soldiers retreating, the Apaches pushing back with desperate fury. "Then I'll make them understand," she said. She rose, standing tall amid the chaos. Her dress torn and her face streaked with blood and dust. She raised both her hands high and shouted until her voice broke. Stop fighting. He's not your enemy." Her cry was so raw that it stunned even the wind. For a moment, the firing slowed. The soldiers hesitated, recognizing the voice they had come to save. Her father saw her standing there, framed against the red horizon, and something in him broke. He dropped his revolver into the sand. "Cease fire," he yelled, waving his arms. "Hold your fire, for God's sake." The Apache fighters held back as well, uncertain. The smoke began to thin, revealing the bodies of men and horses lying still. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound of battle had been. The girl ran back to the warrior, kneeling beside him. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half closed, but he was alive. She pressed her forehead to his chest, whispering his name like a prayer. Her father approached slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel. He stopped a few feet away, staring down at the man who had once been his enemy. His face was pale and drawn, the weight of the years heavy in his eyes. "He saved you," he said softly. It wasn't a question anymore. It was the first truth he had spoken in years. The girl nodded through her tears. "He gave me life when I had none left. He taught me how to live again. He taught me love." The old man sank to his knees beside them, his pride crumbling into the dust. For the first time, he saw the warrior not as an enemy, but as a man. The sun dipped lower, washing the desert in gold. The surviving soldiers watched in silence as their commander removed his hat, bowing his head. The Apache elders came forward, their faces solemn but calm. Without words, they gathered their wounded and began tending to the fallen from both sides. By nightfall, fires burned quietly. The stars returned to the sky, cold and distant, watching over what was left of them. The girl sat beside the warrior, wrapping his shoulder with cloth torn from her own dress. Her father sat nearby, silent, as if afraid to speak and shatter what little peace remained. Hours passed before the warrior finally opened his eyes again. He looked at her, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "The earth is kind," he whispered. She took his hand, holding it against her heart. "And so are you." The old man rose, walking to the edge of the canyon where the horizon glowed faintly with the dying firelight. He looked out at the land, the same land he had once tried to own. He saw now how small he was against it, how foolish it had been to think any man could possess something so ancient. "I've spent my life fighting the wrong battles," he said quietly. The girl turned toward him, her face gentle. "Then let this be the last one." Morning came soft and clear. The soldiers buried their dead beside the Apache fallen. There were no flags, no words of victory, only silence and the sound of wind moving through the canyons. When it was time to leave, the rancher turned to his daughter. "If you wish to stay," he said, "I won't stop you. You belong where your heart is." She looked at him for a long moment, then hugged him tightly. "I'll come back one day," she said, "but not yet." He nodded, understanding what words could not say. He mounted his horse and rode away with the surviving men, disappearing into the long line of dust and morning light. The girl watched until he was gone, then turned back toward the camp. The warrior was waiting for her, standing near the fire, his arm bandaged but strong again. She walked to him, and he reached out his hand. Together they stood on the ridge, watching the desert breathe under the new sun. The war between their worlds wasn't truly over. It never would be, but something had changed. The earth had witnessed love where there should have been hate. And that, in its quiet way, was victory enough. Seasons passed. The rancher rebuilt what he had lost, but he never again raised a fence on the open plain. He let the wild grass grow over the land and sent word to the nearby settlements that no Apache would be hunted again from his borders. Sometimes at dusk, he would stand by the porch and look west toward the red horizon, wondering if she still walked those canyons, and she did. She and the warrior built a small home where the cliffs met the river. Life was hard but honest, the kind that asked nothing but gave everything back. The wind carried the sound of their laughter through the valleys, a quiet promise that even in a land born of pain and fire, love could take root and live. The girl who had once been frail and skeletal was no longer a ghost of the past. She was strong, alive, and whole. The warrior, once bound by loss, found peace in her presence. Together they healed not only each other, but the memory of two worlds that had spent too long divided by fear and time. The desert forgot the battle, but remembered their names. The people who passed through the valley spoke of the pale woman who lived among the Apache, the one who crossed the boundaries of blood and history to love freely. And when the wind blew across the red cliffs, it carried their story of a father's guilt, a warrior's courage, and a love that mended what the world had broken. The land remained as it always had, wide, wild, and eternal, but now it held a softer kind of silence, the kind that belongs to peace. And in that silence, under the same sun that had once burned them all, the story of the frail daughter and the Apache warrior lived on. As the earth itself whispered of love's quiet power to heal what hate could never destroy,